While I really love my Arcade1Up Tempest cabinet, I never liked the printed coin door. In fact, when I built the cabinet, I purposely installed that panel backwards to hide the door inside the machine. Although I was fine with the game's front panel in plain black, once I got my Simpsons cabinet with its molded coin doors that I lit with LEDs, well, Tempest started looking just a little too plain. Fortunately, I found the answer in a 3D printed coin door offered by Graphics Arcade on Etsy.com. I ordered the door kit, which also includes LED push buttons. The coin door measures 8 by 8 inches, and you can order it decorated for one of several arcade game manufacturers. In addition to the 3D print, you get 2 push buttons that plug into the door. These include LEDs and momentary contact switches. To do the project, I moved the machine out of my arcade and into my workshop. Next, I removed the back panel. To connect the LEDs to the marquee's power supply, I used the two-way splitter with the 2.1 connectors. Since the marquee has 1.35mm plugs and sockets, I had to order a couple of adapters from Amazon.com. I needed a 2.1 female to 1.35mm male jack and a 2.1 male to 1.35mm female jack to complete the connections. I added one of each adapter to the splitter as shown, leaving me a single 2.1 male plug to power the LEDs. I also ordered a 1 meter length of 2.1mm power cable from LEDsupply.com to make sure I had enough length to connect the marquee splitter to the coin door buttons. To install the splitter, I removed the marquee plug from its socket and plugged it into the 1.35 female adapter on the splitter. I then plugged the 1.35 male pin into the marquee power socket in the game. At this point, I wanted to test the LEDs on the push buttons, so I connected their power cables together and plugged them into the remaining 2.1mm pin on the splitter. I powered up the machine, and as you can see, the LEDs operate just fine this way. The next project was to make the connections to the control deck so that the coin buttons work in conjunction with the player selection buttons. I removed the deck from the game and removed the screws that hold the deck's dust cover in place. When the deck's upside down, the player buttons are on the right, and I labeled them with tape so I could keep them straight. Since the coin buttons come with JST connectors installed, I ordered jumper cables with the same JST sockets from Amazon. For the cables to pass through the deck's dust cover, I drilled a 1/2-inch hole through one of the 2 dimples in the bottom of the plastic piece. For both sets of buttons to work, I spliced the wires together. First, I trimmed one of the JST jumper cables to 20 inches, then I split the end of the paired wire by 2 to 3 inches. To make the splice, I used Scotch-Lock 558 insulation displacement connectors, also called IDCs or suitcase connectors. I bought a bag of 25 from micromark.com, but you can find similar products at hardware stores and home centers. To make a splice, I slipped one wire from the player selection 1 button into the open side of the IDC. Then I folded up the small side door and snapped it shut, which holds the wire in place. Next, I took one of the wires from the jumper cable and I slipped it into the remaining open hole in the connector. To make the electrical connection, I needed to crimp the metal blade down using a pair of pliers set to the wide jaw setting. When crimped, the blade cuts through the insulation on both wires, completing the circuit. After crimping, I made sure the blade was pressed all the way down, then closed the door with a snap to seal it up tight. I did the player 1 button first, labeling the jumper cable with a piece of tape, before doing the second. I then threaded the jumpers through the hole in the dust cover and replaced its screws. With the jumpers installed and the power connections completed, I set the deck aside and worked on removing the kick plate from the cabinet. I loosened the 4 screws that connect the screen to the left side of the cabinet as looking from the back. Next, I loosened the 2 front lower screws that held that side to the base and the K support. This allows the cabinet side to separate from the machine by about 3/8 of an inch, which is just enough to remove the small panel that fits under the deck and the larger kick plate below it. Before working on the kick plate, I flipped it around the way it should have been installed with the printed coin door facing out, and I put it back into the machine briefly. I used masking tape to mark the panel where it meets the bottom of the K support inside the cabinet. All the drilling needs to occur below the top of this tape to avoid hitting the K support. As shown here, the Graphics Arcade coin door is smaller than the printed coin door, so for this modification you have to use the back of the panel to avoid anything that looks awkward. I used a square to line up the panel location. The kick plate is 18 inches wide and the coin door is 8 inches wide, so to center the door I needed to leave 5 inches on either side. Once I had it lined up, I taped the door temporarily in place to hold it. Using a sharp pencil, I marked the circular openings in the coin door buttons, and then I lined up a straight edge along the button alignment pins to get a center line for each hole. From there, I marked the centers by eye. As a final step, I used an awl to place a starter dimple in each of the openings. The dimple helps guide the drill bit. The push buttons require a hole that's 15/16 of an inch or bigger. I used a 1-inch Forstner bit to give myself a little wiggle room for adjusting the door once it's installed. Before using the larger bit, I drilled smaller pilot holes centered on the dimples. And then, using the 1-inch bit, I drilled partway through one side first, then flipped the panel over. Using the pilot hole again, I centered the bit on the back of the panel and drilled out the rest of the material. This technique gives you a clean hole each time without damaging the surface of the hardboard. Back at the workbench, I positioned the coin door again to make sure the holes lined up, and then set to work inserting the push buttons into the printed piece. These just snap into place and should fit flush with the front of the door. The door attaches to the kick plate using the included locking nuts. After setting the nuts finger tight, I checked that the door was level on the kick plate and then tightened them the rest of the way down. Next, I reinstalled the kick plate into the cabinet and replaced all of the screws for the panel and the display screen. I then installed the LEDs and contact switches into the back of the push buttons. I lined up the pins on the white LED housings and then locked them into the push buttons with the twisting motion. Next, I connected the 12-volt power to the LEDs and replaced the deck into the cabinet. I then plugged the JST connectors together to join the coin door buttons to the cabinet's player selection buttons. Looking at the front of the machine, the player 1 button connects to the left-hand coin button. From there, I powered up the game to test my work. The button LEDs lit at the same time as the marquee, which is what I'd wanted. And after the game booted up, I tested the coin door buttons in place of the player 1 and player 2 buttons, and they worked exactly as they should. Satisfied with my test, I replaced the back of the cabinet and then wheeled the machine back into my arcade. This was a fun project that added a lot to the otherwise plain appearance of my Tempest game. The graphics arcade kit is well made and easy to install, and after adding just a few more jumper cables, I am thrilled that the coin door buttons not only light up, but they are fully functional components on the cabinet. The entire project took a little more than an hour to complete, so I'm pretty sure my Ms. Pac-Man cabinet is going to be next for this treatment. To see more Arcade1Up coin door options, check out Graphics Arcade on Etsy. And check out my other easy Arcade1Up mod projects on my Pop Art Studios YouTube channel.